Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Inept General, and today we have some Total War Warhammer 2 news. We have had the High Elf roster revealed to us, as it will appear starting at the beginning of the Total War Warhammer game. So let's not dilly-dally, shall we? Let's get straight into it with the Legendary Lords. As you guys know, do check out the lore video if you're interested on my channel that just went up right now. But we have the starting Legendary Lords of Tyrion and Teclis, the twin brothers. As many of you guys will know, Tyrion is the much more melee-focused lord. Teclis is the much more magical-focused lord. They both have horse mounts, elven steed mounts, with Tyrion getting his named mounts, which I can't pronounce off the top of my head just now, or actually can't remember off the top of my head just now. But he has a special name mount. They're both very quick mounts, but no flying mounts for either Tyrion or Teclis in the game. Now, as I said, guys, if you want to check the lore video, do check the top right-hand corner now or the description below. And if you'd like a bit more details on any one of the units we're about to cover in terms of their history, where they're from, their story, do check my High Elf potential army lore video in the top right-hand corner now, or again in the description below for a little bit more detail. In today's video, I'm really just going to go over the broad strokes and all the little bits and details they mentioned of how these characters will play in Total War Warhammer 2, rather than necessarily how they play on the tabletop and how my guess might be to all the details of how they'll play on Total War Warhammer 2. So just bear that in mind, guys. Full details, check the army video. Otherwise, today's just a bit of a skim over what we have and what we don't. So Tyrion, this is what we have. He'll be melee focused, but a duelist. So he won't be doing vast, sweeping amounts of area of effect damage. He's not great. He'll be good enough against regiments, but he's much better off challenging an enemy lord or an enemy monster or an enemy dragon. And he does have I believe he does have the Aphilmar armor, which will give, I do believe he has actually maybe armor against fire resistance. I can't remember that off the top of my head if that's what they said in the video, but that's something worth watching out for. Now, we also have Teclis, who is squishy. We've seen him in the trailer. We know what his model looks like already in Total War Warhammer 2. And Teclis will be a powerful magic user. We didn't get any details on how his magic in particular is going to work in Total War Warhammer 2. We did get that he will have a unarmored and armored elven steed as a mount, and that's it. He'll also have a potion which grants him either, I think I got the impression it wasn't necessarily healing, but more physical resistance. And that physical resistance will allow him to be a bit more survival if he's ever caught out in melee combat, but it will also detract from the rate at which his mana regenerates. So he'll be slightly less effective at spell casting, but if he gets caught out in melee, he's a bit more survivable thanks to that potion of his. And this kind of sticks to the lore to the effect that he, at some point in his life, needed potions, but at the time of, let's say, the Total War Warhammer begins, he's meant to be kind of beyond that. He's meant to be reached such a level of control of his magic that and with the gifts and artifacts he's been given, that he doesn't really need potions to survive anymore. But as they mentioned in the video, it's a bit of a throwback to an earlier version of his lore for the potion. So he's getting the potion that does that, a special potion for him. So that's Teclis, mounted on a horse. That's about it. Very powerful magic user. Shame we won't be able to get him up in the air, but you know what? He might be great to play anyway. So we have two forms of I don't want to say melee focus lord, but we've got the princes and something that's new to Total War Warhammer, not necessarily in Warhammer's book, is the idea of the princesses. Now, starting with the princes, these are going to be much more melee-focused generals. They will be armed with sword and shield. They will have several choices of mount. They will have the elven steed, the great eagle, the sun dragon, and star dragons. Now, for those of you who don't know, there are several tiers of dragon in the elven army books. There's sun dragons, which are the youngest. That goes up to moon dragons, and then it goes up to star dragons, which are at the very top of the list. Now, you'll note that the princes do not have access to the moon dragons as a mount. So that's what they'll be like. And I actually had a chance to play against one of these guys when I got a chance to get a preview of the E3 demo that Creative Assembly will be putting on for Total War Warhammer 2 over there. So yeah, they do have the shields. We've seen that variety of general. Well, I've seen that variety of general, and yeah, with shield, that's him, much more melee focused. Now going down to the princesses, we've had some concept art for the princesses before, but I don't think we've seen them as of yet. So the princess's mounts are slightly different, and so is what she's about. She's a much more missile-focused lord, so much more akin to the kind of branching efforts you got in the Wood Elf army, if you guys have had an opportunity to play that, where you have one general who you can train to be more melee-focused and one to be more missile-focused. This looks like it slightly takes that choice out of your hands, and you have to pick the princess who's more melee-focused and the prince who's much more who's more missile-focused, the princess, and the prince who's much more melee-focused. Now, her mounts are different as well. They mentioned that the concept behind the princess was to get her into dragons later on, but that she'd start off from a more powerful dragon. So whereas the noble goes from a sun dragon to a star dragon, he skips out the in-between dragon, which is the moon dragon. The princess gets access to, I believe it's the elven steed, the eagle, and then she goes straight to the moon dragon, skipping the sun dragon, but they both get access to the star dragon. And that's how that will work out for you as the princess. A final mechanic that Creative Assembly also mentioned was the fact that to recruit some of these generals, whether it be the prince or the princess, to get really the best ones, you have to expend what they just referred to as political capital. Now, there were no hints about how one gains political capital in the campaign. One has to assume it's either tied to trade or the aspect of the High Elf campaign they've mentioned several times over, which is this idea of building spy networks throughout the Warhammer world, and that's maybe a way that political capital is raised. But for the moment, we're not really sure. It was just mentioned that to get the best generals, you have to spend political capital. Maybe not unlike how in Rome 2, to promote people in your own family to certain positions of political power, you had to maybe give up some power in the Roman Senate. Maybe something similar to that, but probably not as complex. Now, as far as heroes go, you get the Noble, which is kind of like the equivalent of the Empire Captain, melee focused. Now, he will have options of being on foot, of course, barded steed. He'll also have the option of a more melee focused chariot and a great eagle as his mounts for the noble. Another note for the nobles is that the nobles in Total War Warhammer 2 will be armed with halberds, making them anti-large heroes. Now, this begs the question, why not make them like you did with the Loremasters of Hoeth? Why not make them the Anointed of Assyrian instead of just generic nobles? But I don't know. So there will be a distinction between the Loremasters, who will be anti-infantry, and the nobles and the sort of generals, princes even, who will be not have that anti-large bonus. But these nobles will. So there we go. So, yeah, pretty much standard. He'll probably have stuff like upgrading your army, getting them trained, lowering cost of recruitment, stuff we've seen before. Now, another hero is the Mage. Now, in the list they've released, they actually put no mounts for the Mage, but in the E3 demo battle I fought, there were mages on chariots, so I'm not sure which side of it they really fall on, whether they just forgot to include the mounts for the mages, or it just didn't sort of come across to them, they just forgot about it, or they just don't have them, in fact. So there are mages, but maybe unmounted, but I have seen mages on chariots in the game, so a bit up in the air. But you'll have mages of all the different lores. I imagine they'll work much like the mages that we've seen in Total War Warhammer 1. Now, here's something some people might find slightly controversial. Loremasters of Hoeth, or Hoeth, are a magic user, melee-focused fighting lord, and in the tabletop, they are a general type. However, in Total War Warhammer 2, they've downgraded them to being heroes. So they'll be melee-focused heroes with the ability to have magic at the same time. Now, I did hypothesize back when the trailer came out that this character here who appeared in the trailer might actually be a Loremaster, and it looks like he actually is. He's been toned down a bit from his rather rambunctious look here, but yeah, I think this might be the Loremaster, and we've seen them appear in the game. Because I have seen the generals, and the generals do have shields. Maybe it's just that when they made the trailer, it was slightly different. But I'm going to guess this is maybe what the Loremasters look like. So the Loremasters are heroes in Total War Warhammer 2. They'll have access to a greatsword, armor piercing, do decent in melee, and they'll have access to magic. No access to mounts, however. These guys will always be on foot. A pretty handy type of hero to have, if I don't say so myself. But again, some people might be upset that they've been downgraded to a hero rather than a general type. And as I said, yeah, that's what they look like in the trailer. Well, that's what they might look like in the trailer. Again, might just be a mix-up. They might have just been toying around with animations, but you never know. Now, when talking about a lot of the units coming up in the Elfen army, the High Elf army, they did mention that they can't translate a lot of the rules from the tabletop, which is understandable. Rules like always strike first, whereby you would always get to roll first if you were the elf player in combat because elves are quick, can't really be represented in the same way in Total War Warhammer. One rule they did mention, however, that they have tried to implement was the idea of martial prowess. Now, martial prowess, if I remember correctly, on the tabletop, was a rule that sort of symbolized the martial skill of a lot of elves, their speed, their dexterity, their dedication to the art of sort of martial arts and how to fight with weaponry. And that showed by the fact that they were able to attack with an extra rank than most other standard armies. So you'd get more attacks in than necessarily your opposition. But I think the way, if I remember, that's what martial prowess was. I may be incorrect on that one, but I think that's what it was. And in Total War Warhammer, they've taken that rule and adapted it to make it the fact that if you are at full health, your elves will fight better. They'll be more akin to what's going on, more so than just being fresh. More in tune with each other's movements. They will be wearing their full regalia. They'll be proud of their appearance. They'll launch into combat. But as they start to lose health, they get more tired, they get more battered down. That benefit starts to erode away. So I think what they said in the stream was that between 0 and 50% health, you'll get this martial prowess bonus. But after 50% health has gone by, the High Elves do not gain that benefit anymore. So it's good that they're trying to implement some rules from the tabletop and find an adequate translation. Whether that's the best translation of that rule, I think is debatable, if I'm honest. But there we go. There's a rule that will apply to a number of the units we're going to discuss going forward. Next up, we have the Militia Archers. We've seen these guys. We're told that these guys will have two variants. They will have just the normal Militia Archer and the Militia Archer with light armor to make them slightly more resilient. Now, these guys were described as the best regimental shooting unit in the game, in both games. But remains to be see how well they do. They will have immensely long range. They will be armed with long bows. They said in today's announcement. So they will have they'll described as very powerful early shooting unit. So watch out for them. We've seen them what they look like in the game already. That looks fairly true to kind of what they look like there, the white robes and stuff. Everyone complains about the blues in the Elven army, but there we go. So those are the missiles. We also have the Militia Spearmen, and again, we've seen these guys in the trailer, we've seen these guys in a lot of different pictures so far. Standard Spearmen, they'll hold the line, fairly well disciplined for your basic Spearman unit. And they also announced the inclusion, sort of on this kind of militia level unit, of something called the Gate Guard Garrison. Now, if you guys have had a chance to see my campaign information, which I got from a Q&A I was invited to at Creative Assembly, check the top right-hand corner if you haven't. But that outlined that there are gates in between the inner and outer kingdoms of Ulthuan. And these gates are built within mountains, and they stop you getting from the inner to the outer kingdoms. And at these gates, there will be siege battles on the campaign in Total War Warhammer 2. And these siege battles will have regiments garrisoned in them, but will not be appearing in custom battles known as the Gate Guard Garrison. Now, this is something that Creative Assembly have just come up with themselves. Apparently, there'll be a very good missile regiment, but that's all we know. And they won't. It looks like they won't be recruitable necessarily to your armies. It's just that they'll appear at these gates to hold the line against any potential invaders of the kingdoms of Ulthuan. So that's an interesting little unit to be included. And so, yeah, moving on from the spearmen and those guard militia, those gate guard, we have the Lothern Sea Guard. Now, I had mentioned a little while ago when I first did my High Elf Army video, the Lothern Sea Guard have shields and hand weapons, and they shoot as well. And someone drew the comparison to the Quarrelers of the Dwarves, because they have shields in Total War Warhammer. But I think these guys will work slightly differently, and it's been described that they'll work slightly differently. They described more how I imagine they work, in that they will shoot until they are automatically... until they're charged, and then they will switch out to their spears and shields. Now, what does this mean? Now, this is where a mechanical flaw might turn up in the Lothern Sea Guard. Effectively, one has to go on how this programmable AI behavior might work when they're switching out their weapons to their spears and shields to take a charge from cavalry, unlike the Dwarven Quarrelers, who would just get charged while they had their quarrels in hand, while they had their crossbows in hand, and then only once they were in combat did they switch out to the weapon animation. So it makes them slightly different to that in the way they play in Total War Warhammer 2. Now, my issue with this is, particularly in multiplayer, in the campaign it won't be too much of a problem, but in multiplayer, is this just going to encourage people to not directly double-click on this unit from a distance away, so the charge is in effect and the AI knows it's getting charged and thus picks up the spears? Would this make people start to move up to Lothern Sea Guard and then just charge them at the last minute so they can't react and get their spears up in time, thus taking the full brunt of any charge you can throw at them? I don't know, but there is a mechanic here that has the potential to be taken advantage of, particularly when playing against a human player. Just something that popped into my head and might be worth watching out for. But on the whole, in the campaign, you line your front line with spearmen who are automatically armed with bows. That will be a great and powerful front line for the High Elves. Now, the difference between these and the militia archers is that these guys will not be armed with what Creative Assembly called the longbows, so they will have shorter range than the militia archers themselves. So that seems how they're going to distinguish them in Total War Warhammer 2. So yeah, looking forward to that. I'm really interested to see how this unit plays. As I said in my High Elf Army video, one of the ones I'm looking forward to seeing the most, just out of pure curiosity to how they've programmed them and how they work in Total War Warhammer. So moving on from the Lothern Sea Guard, we have the White Lions. Now, the White Lions have apparently been slightly downgraded in terms of their abilities, perhaps, because the way it was described in the stream today was that you have your militia spearmen, then you have like your Lothern Sea Guard, and then you have the White Lions, and then the Swordmasters, like the best infantry you can get. Now, on the tabletop, they're much more on par with maybe the Swordmasters than necessarily being one link in the upgrade tree to Swordmasters. So that made me question it a little bit. But they have some interesting abilities. A fair translation of some of their rules on the tabletop is they do have missile resistance thanks to their lion cloaks. They've been given, I think it's Forest Strider, the rule that a lot of the Wood Elf units have, where they perform much better in the woods. And this speaks to some of their history about being woodsmen. But they've moved on from that quite a bit as far as what White Lions are nowadays. They're all just elite veterans, fighting veterans, just that's how their regiment got founded by woodsmen. Doesn't mean they're all woodsmen today, but that's something I'm willing to overlook. So it's an interesting little application of their rules. Now, moving on from the White Lions, we mentioned them slightly already, but we have the Swordmasters. Now, the Swordmasters have been described as faster, as more effective than the great swords of the Empire, as stronger slightly. So it looks like these guys will run over Empire great swords, and they've done it to such an extent that the guy hasn't put in the idea of parrying for the Swordmasters. Sorry for the extra H there, guys. That's a typo on my part. But for the Swordmasters. So the Swordmasters won't have the parry thing at the moment. But he says if you want to make a issue of it, bring it up in the forums and they'll see it. So if you guys want the Swordmasters to have missile resistance, thanks to their tabletop ability of being able to parry away some missile attacks, do give them a shout. But at the moment, their thinking is these guys are already a little bit too OP, so they haven't given them the missile parry ability they have on the tabletop. I'd like to see them with the parry ability personally. Just go to town. If you're going to make them strong, make them super. So I would like to see them with the parry ability personally, just because it's truer to the tabletop and truer to their skill. The idea is they're so skillful with their huge greatswords, which are lighter than normal like human swords and much more finely balanced, that they can be so swift that they're simply knocking arrows out of the air and don't really need shields. So that's the idea behind the Swordmasters. But they will be making an appearance in the game. Looking forward to them, hopefully with missile resistance. And then we have the Phoenix Guard. They will have their ward save. They will be very tanky. They were described as being able to deal with the Chosen of Chaos Halberdiers, like Chaos Chosen Halberdiers, but the Chaos Chosen will deal more damage. These guys will just outlast them because they're that tanky. Now, this might be due to the fact that these guys have a ward save, and they were described as having a ward save in Total War Warhammer 2. No mention of whether they have fear, because I think they cause fear on tabletop, if I remember correctly. But no mention of whether they do that in Total War Warhammer. So there we go. But at least we've got them. We've got the Phoenix Guard. And that is brilliant. Great to see them. Can't wait to see them in the game. Next up, moving on to Cavalry, we have the Illyrian Reavers. Now, these guys are kind of your typical light cav. Now, the way it was described in the stream was that they will have effectively two variants of this unit. One with spears and one with bows. Now, not one necessarily with both, which was a bit of a downer, but you know what, that's okay. So these are two variants. They will have Vanguard. So these are really your light cav. Hide them in some forests, get them to take out some missiles, some pieces of artillery, stuff like that. That's really what you'll end up using the Illyrian Reavers for, it seems like, in Total War Warhammer 2. Very, very quick, very good at attacking. As long as they're not necessarily going into like another anti-large or another cavalry unit, they should be fine. Silver Helms, kind of your atypical Knights of the Empire-esque type guys. They will, be kind of the mainstay of the Elven Cav. They will come with a shielded and non-shielded variety. I think these guys might be a bit more melee focused. I'm not 100% sure on that, whether they're necessarily shock or more like a melee grindy cav. But yeah, they'll be armed with lance and sword probably. And have a shielded and non-shielded variety available in Total War Warhammer 2. Next up, we have the Dragon Princes of Caledor, the most arrogant and conceited fighters in the High Elf army. They are making a solid appearance in the game. They were touted as the top three of the cavalry units we've seen so far in Total War Warhammer. So I'm guessing Blood Knights, maybe Grail Knights as well is what they were looking at for the other ones, as my guess is. Maybe Chaos Knights as well, actually. So I'm not sure where they fit in on that plethora. But there we go. The Dragon Princes of Caledor will be in the game. Once rode dragon, now ride kick-ass looking elven steeds. So that's them. Next up, we have the Tyrion Chariot. Now, the Tyrion Chariot, they are doing something very interesting with. They said that a lot of the chariot stuff in Total War Warhammer 1, particularly missile chariots, failed because there just wasn't enough arrows going out of the missile chariots. And they're right, there wasn't. So what they've done with the Tyrion Chariots in Total War Warhammer 2, with the missile variant, there are two variants. There's a more melee-focused variant and a missile variant. And the missile variant will have their bowmen equipped with reaver bows, which allows them to shoot several shots at once. So you're firing sort of 6 shots at once from one of these chariots, and then even once they run out of ammo, they can get in there, do a bit of damage themselves. So that's the idea. So they will be by far the most effective missile chariot as far as shooting goes. But I think that was a change worth making, and something maybe worth revisiting for some of the other missile chariots in Total War Warhammer, the first game, particularly over the combined map, when you could be able to play as the First World races as well, just to try and maybe up those missile chariots a little bit too. So moving on from the Tyrion chariot, there's also the... now they referred it to as the Ilfmarian chariot, but I think Ilfmar just refers to the armor barding that horses wear in the Elven army, if I remember correctly. Sorry, just going off the top of my head here, guys. Elves not my first faction, but that's what they referred to it as in the video, the Ilfmarian chariot, which is just more that the horses will have barding and that there'll be spearmen on the chariot rather than bowmen, and so that will be your melee focused chariot charging into and out of combat, trying to do as much damage as possible on the charge. So that's those two. Next up, we have the Eagle Bolt Thrower. We've seen this before in the game. That's what it looks like. Now, I think someone actually did a video where they counted these, and I think they counted 20 of them. Now, there's only going to be 13 shots flying out of these, so I don't know whether they just did the 20 to make it uniform and look pretty. But there are 2 firing modes. So there's a firing mode where it fires 1 big bolt, probably better suited to shooting at giants or big monsters. And there's one where you're shooting 13 different shots, and that's going probably more into infantry to try and maximize the amount of damage you're doing there. So there are 2 firing modes on them when they make an appearance in Total War Warhammer 2. Now, Great Eagles are making an appearance in the game. We've mentioned them a couple of times already. They will be mounts. They will also be standalone units. They're relatively cheap, very much like we saw Great Eagles in the Wood Elves army. Not a lot difference there. So that's about it. Great Eagles, we've seen them before. Not a huge surprise, but there we go. Now let's get on to something interesting and something I was curious about how they try and implement. So let's start off with the Flamespire Phoenix. Now, both types of Phoenix are in the game, not as mounts, because the people who would ride Phoenix were technically a unit that's not in the game, but we'll get to that when you get into our missing units section. But the Flamespire Phoenix, it looks like, will just be by itself, and it has a couple of abilities that have been translated over from the tabletop. The first they mentioned was Wake of Fire, which is the idea on the tabletop that as the Phoenix flies over units, the units it flies over takes damage. Now, this has been implemented much like the bombardment ability of the gyro bombers, or indeed now the pterodactyls, of the lizard men. And so they will go in, and it's a bomb, but you can tap it rapidly. So it can kind of just like have a stream of destruction rather than stuff like the gyro bombers or the pterodons even, not the pterodactyls, which I said before, who have the rocks to drop. So you can just spam it, and it can cause an entire line of destruction very rapidly, dropping those bombs. Now, how many they have to use, I don't know. How quickly they can use those, I'm not sure if it's a limited use or not, but that's how they work. Now, a rule that I thought we would never see in Total War Warhammer 2 was that the Flamespire Phoenix can be resurrected when they're super low on health or just about to die. There's just what they've done, they've just made it a 50-50 shot. 50% chance that the Flamespire Phoenix just comes back to life, not full life, bear in mind, but comes back with a little bit of extra life, and you can resume to use the unit on the battlefield. Now, what exactly that looks like, I don't know, but I'm just glad they've put the mechanic in there. I think that's absolutely amazing. So the Flamespire Phoenixes can come back to life. Now, the other type of Phoenix the High Elves have is a Frostheart Phoenix. Now, these guys don't resurrect. In the lore, they don't resurrect, so they don't in Total War Warhammer 2 either. But these guys have just been described as tanky. They will have an aura of cold around them that lowers the combat abilities of enemies around them. So not only are they hard and tanky, but they're also like they debuff you and your ability to hurt them in the first place. So a great little support, maybe melee focused Phoenix here, as opposed to the bomb running Flamespire Phoenix. So really looking forward to seeing what these look like in Total War Warhammer 2. I think they could look amazing, which yeah, fingers crossed they will. Can't wait to see the Phoenixes in the game. So let's have a bit of a word about dragons. Individual dragons will be based in the game as well as having dragons as mounts. So don't worry if you have a Prince General, you'll still be able to get a Star Dragon in there at some point. Star Dragons being the most powerful. So the way, so you'll have 3 types of dragons. You'll have the Sun Dragon, the Moon Dragon, and the Star Dragon. Now he said that the Moon Dragon's missile attack is particularly powerful. It looks less like flames spewing out of the dragon and more like a laser kind of spewing down, like taking out an area. He worried it might be a bit OP, but there are limited shots with the Moon Dragon apparently. So I imagine more limiting than the amount of shots you'll have with, say, the Sun Dragon, if the Sun Dragon's limited at all, if it can just keep spewing out fire. We'll have to wait and see. But those are the dragons in Total War Warhammer 2. You'll get all 3 variants. All of them are there, which is fantastic to see. Don't know if their color palettes are different or anything like that, but super looking forward to each of them in Total War Warhammer 2. So moving on from the dragons, let's move on to what we don't have. Now, some of this, much like the Lizardmen roster reveal, does hint at some future DLC. Now, it's not as obvious as the Lizardmen one necessarily. In fact, it hints at maybe a couple of DLCs, but I'll get through that in a little bit. But if you'd like to see my overall arching video on future DLCs and how they fit into, upon which these 2 options I did include, do check the top right hand corner now for my future DLC video or the description below. But the first missing unit is a general, the Anointed of Asuryan. Now, these guys are effectively Phoenix Guard generals. They come from the Temple of Asuryan, and they tend to ride the Phoenixes we spoke about before. But they're not in the game, no Anointed of Asuryan. And indeed, the Archmages have not made an appearance. There are no generic magic casters in the High Elf army as generals. They will be heroes, but not generals, apart from Teclis, which is rather strange, but there we go. That makes quite a change to the what I thought would be the lineup for the generals in the High Elf army. But no Archmages as generals, I'm afraid, guys. No Sea Helms. Now, these guys tend to ride these, the Lothern Skycutters. No Skycutters in the game either, as a kind of flying chariot. So, sometimes with a bolt thrower on the back. So, no Skycutters, no Sea Helms. Bit of a shame, but I imagine if these guys appear, they'll probably appear together. No Lion Chariot. This was a guessing one. I thought there'd be a Lion Chariot, but they made the Chariot of Tyrion just have a melee focused and a missile focused variant, and we don't see a Lion Chariot of Krace mounted by the White Lions. That's a terrible shame. These guys could have been devastating. It would have been great to just see huge lions bounding around the battlefield, biting off lizardmen heads and alike. But no Lion Chariot, guys. And no Shadow Warriors. Now, this is the first one that hints at a possible future DLC. Now, I suspect that these guys are less likely to come in an individual DLC themselves, but they will be tied to a character known as Alith Anar, the Shadow King. Now, Alith Anar, if you want a bit of lore on him, again, guys, top right-hand corner for my likely Legendary Lords video for the High Elves. But I think there is a chance he might appear as a free Legendary Lord along with a different pack, in which case these guys will be included kind of as a bonus. But I had a hard time trying to place him in a specific lore pack with a partner, as Creative Assembly looked like that's how they like doing it, by tying Legendary Lords with partners and having them fight it off. My guess was with him and another one another Dark Elf hero, but do check out my future DLC video for that, as I mentioned before. No Griffin mounts for the High Elves either. Maybe just trying to differentiate them from the Empire a little bit that way. But technically, the High Elves do have access to Griffins as well. And no Dragon Mages. Now, as I said, this might actually be an issue that resolves itself. But in the High Elf army, there's the idea that there are mages who specialize themselves in such a way that they are able to ride dragons. Now, this actually fundamentally changes how they access magic, and they only have access to fire magic when they go through this change and take up a dragon as a mount. So one could argue that maybe they forgot the mounts for the mages, because as I said, I've seen mages on chariots in Total War Warhammer 2, at least the demo I got to play. But they could just upgrade those mages to allow them to have dragons, or maybe dragon mages come along at a later point as part of a maybe dragon-themed DLC. Again, one I've hypothesized about in my future DLC video, so do check that out. Now, here's one that will be a blindingly obvious addition to any DLC package, is the Sisters of Avalorn. Now, these guys are lady warriors from the elven ranks, taken up to serve the Everqueen of the Elves, who is not a starting legendary lord, but may be added as a future DLC. As you guys may know, this points towards the favorite idea of the DLC for the High Elves, which is the idea of having the Everqueen matched up with a Dark Elf character known as Helbrun. So that's one of the most hypothesized DLC packages talked about, and the fact that the Sisters of Avalorn are missing and their upgraded hero version, the Handmaidens, are missing, hints that we will see the Everqueen, pictured here on the right, appearing in a DLC at a later date. So that about sums it up for the whole of the High Elf army as it will begin in Total War Warhammer 2. Do let me know what you guys think of it. Do drop it in the comments if you're super hyped for any unit or super bummed that you're not seeing a unit you like. Do check out some of the videos I've mentioned as far as future DLC ideas, because this seems to fit into a couple of them very nicely and hint at them coming up. Yeah, do catch the next one, guys. As always, a special thank you to my patrons, John, Reese, Colin, Thomas, Mateus, Samuel, Matthews, Peter, and David. Thank you, guys. And yeah, everyone, hope to catch you on the next one. We have the High Elf roster. That's exciting. It's getting ever closer, step by step, guys. All right, guys, see you on the next one.